Happy Monday, and thank you for joining us for today's Batten Hour. My name's Jeff Chittister, and I am the Executive Director of External Affairs here at Batten, and it's a pleasure to welcome Phil today and offer a few brief introductory remarks before he gets going. So one of the great things about Batten Hour is that it serves as a vehicle for engagement on some of the most pressing and important issues of the day. And today's topic is certainly fits within that description. While much of the attention on the new Biden administration has centered around its COVID response and related economic stimulus, it's also working in haste to forge a new direction in U.S. foreign policy. And this is important because, as our speaker today will tell you, the early days of a new administration are a uniquely precarious period. Professor Phil Potter has been examining this question for many years now. In fact, I first became aware of his research on the relationship between elections and American foreign policy back in late 2015. Phil's scholarship was an integral part of a larger portfolio of work conducted by the Miller Center in 2016, which was aimed at providing historical insight and recommendations to the Trump and Clinton campaigns on how to succeed in the first year of a presidency. Well, we're now in the first month of a new presidency, and Phil's work is once again a must-read as we seek to understand the promise and peril of foreign policy under the Biden administration. And we're so grateful that he's agreed to share his insights and answer questions today. Before I turn it over to Phil, let me provide a bit more background on him and his work. Phil read for his BA at McGill University and earned his PhD from UCLA. He's held fellowships at Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and the University of Pennsylvania's Brown Center for International Politics. From 2009 to 2014, he was an assistant professor at the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. And he's currently an associate professor and director of graduate studies in the University of Virginia's Department of Politics and founding director of the Batten School's National Security Policy Center. Phil's research focuses on foreign policy, international security, and militant violence. He's published articles in a wide range of top journals in his field, including International Organization, Journal of Politics, International Studies Quarterly, the Journal of Conflict Resolution, and the Annual Review of Political Science, among many, many others. His book, War and Democratic Constraint, co-authored with Matthew Baum, a choice outstanding academic title, is available from Princeton University Press. And it makes, I should say, a perfect Valentine's Day present. So it is my pleasure to now hand the Zoom controls over to Professor Phil Potter.
Thanks, Jeff. I strongly suggest skipping that as a Valentine's Day present. So if you get nothing else from this, I would skip that. Thank you so much. It's always fun to talk to this group. You get such a range of sort of perspectives and expertise. So what I want to do is run through first a little bit of the work on elections and foreign policy that Jeff was so generously describing before. Then I want to sort of look at the Biden administration and sort of what the sort of feel in the city is, so to speak, in terms of Washington, D.C., right? What are people talking about? How are people thinking about things? And I'm going to do that through the lens of sort of two reports that are making the insider rounds these days and what we might be able to learn from those. And then I want to close with a little bit of work that I've been doing recently on China and U.S.-China relations. All right, and then I'll try to keep all of that to about 25 minutes, and we can talk about whatever you want at the back end. All right. So let me share my screen here. Does that look okay? Good. Okay, perfect. So I think the question that brings a lot of us here is making a determination about what exactly the foreign policy agenda of the Biden administration is, or what is it going to be, right? As I'll kind of discuss in a minute, these are extraordinary times, right? Certainly the foreign policy challenges are out there, but we are singularly focused on a domestic policy moment. Right, we are fighting a pandemic. We are thinking about vaccine rollout. We are thinking about restarting our economy, these sorts of things. And so foreign policy, while everyone sort of knows that it's out there, is perennially on the back burner, right? And I say perennially because yes, it's on the back burner right now, but I'm going to show you some sort of reason to think that actually this is a pretty systematic issue at the beginning of administrations, that foreign policy is systematically neglected. So this kind of then breaks down into two questions, which is why I am thinking about sort of first systematic relationship between elections and foreign policy, and then second, these sort of insider reports that are making the rounds right now. And those questions are simply sort of, well, how much foreign policy is there going to be, right? How much foreign policy are they going to do? And then the second is, well, what are they going to do? Or what are they going to try to do? All right. And certainly one thing that I sort of preach to students and in classes and whatnot is that we need to think about foreign policy in the context of a full policy portfolio, right? So we need to be thinking about foreign policy in the context of domestic policy as well, particularly in the United States, right? I think foreign policy specialists have a tendency to fall into the trap of assuming that what they care about is what everybody else cares about, right? And that the foreign policy sort of debates of the day are dominating the conversation. In the United States, they rarely do. They take a perennial backseat to domestic politics. All right. And that very much shapes the way administrations approach foreign policy. So there's two kind of components of this that I lay out in a book manuscript that I'm working on right now that I think are worth sort of tracking over time, right? One of these is the growth of experience and expertise, all right? Or putting it sort of reciprocally, the fact that inexperience is concentrated at the beginning of new administrations. Okay? New administrations make mistakes. They are subject to crises. They are subject to mishandling crises. Many presidents come into office with relatively limited foreign policy experience. Biden is sort of a middle of the road example here. He's a long-term senator, but senators don't deal that much with foreign policy. Normally, he did a little more than some. Experience as vice president, though, tends to provide a fair bit of personal experience. So one of the things that's kind of interesting about President Biden is that he has spent more time with President Xi than most leaders have, right? So that accrues to experience. On the flip side, though, and this is why you never want to take your eye off of these things, what really tends to cause problems historically is not the personal experience of the president, but the inexperience of the team and the management structure around foreign policy decision makings when a new administration comes into office. All right. And so no matter how great your constituent parts are, and there's been a lot of praise out there and a lot of sort of back patting in some sense that I think people need to be a little bit careful about in terms of the individual expertise of the people who are coming in on the foreign policy side, no matter how good they are, it takes time for them to gel. All right, it takes time for their communication to get figured out. It takes time for them to sort of determine the pecking order of who answers to who, so that information doesn't get dropped, decisions don't get mangled, these sorts of things. All right. And so that's one strand of this, is that sort of growth of experience and the susceptibility to crisis at the beginning of terms. The second strand of this is this interplay between power and constraint. Okay, going back to what I was talking about a moment ago, presidents don't favor foreign policy. They favor domestic policy if they can get it done. This is the valuable real estate in American politics, right? It goes back to the old adage, it's the economy, stupid, right? Americans vote with their pocketbook. Data tells us that compared to publics in other countries, they know less about foreign policy, they care less about foreign policy, and they certainly don't vote based on foreign policy. And so the bottom line then is that if you come into office, say you're Obama, and you come in with a significant electoral mandate, you come in with a Congress that's on your side, you go for healthcare, right? You get a big legacy domestic achievement done, and you don't go out there and change the world in terms of foreign policy. And so that's something that we're going to be seeing play out in the Biden administration as well. Right. Despite the sort of contested nature of the politics around the election nonetheless left the Biden administration with a fairly significant amount of political runway at the front end of their time in office. Okay. And so you're going to see the administration double down on that. And of course, going back to the very start of the talk, that is a product of the time. right? The demand is absolutely for a response to COVID, for the economy, these sorts of things. But what I'm getting at is there's also just this structural thing baked into the cake that even if that wasn't on the table, we would likely see a Biden administration that was leaning more toward domestic policy. Okay. So just kind of thinking about this and how this all lays out, one of the key things that I'd like to leave you with is this notion that while we're talking about the very left-hand side of this, year one, there are very few points where the electoral cycle isn't sort of systematically impinging on what presidents are incentivized to do with regard to foreign policy. So at the very beginning, you have this inexperienced story, you have this mandate power story that's tending to push foreign policy onto the back burner. You move into a campaign cycle that is also a period where Americans are looking more closely at what presidents are doing, and therefore presidents are inclined to push foreign policy to the back burner. You get all the way out there to the lame duck period. That's when presidents are weakened. You see a lot of foreign policy there, engagement. And so one of the things that kind of comes out of this that I think is really important for these reports that I'm going to move to next is we often see heavy engagement in foreign policy by the presidents who are precisely the most poorly equipped to deliver on it, right? And so they are at points of weakness, politically speaking. And that's when you sort of go for your foreign policy initiatives, all else equal, right? And so some of these big fundamental challenges that we have on the global stage turn out to be super hard for the United States to engage with when they require presidential leadership, right? And I think we're beginning to sort of see the accumulated wounds of that lack of prioritization in a variety of domains. So as I said, not normal times, COVID, economy. Biden administration has meaningful political power, so they're going to be thinking about climate change, race and equity, domestic institutional reform, transportation, healthcare, who knows what else, right? But we've seen this sort of in what's been laid out. It's been very much a domestic policy agenda. But at the same time, the world's not going to wait for us. Increasingly, there is a bipartisan call to confront China in a more meaningful way. What's, I think, interesting from the last administration, and particularly the last election, is that when you look at the Chinese media, they read a lot of what's gone on as indications of a power in decline, right? That the United States is a power in decline, right? And so when you look at how that country is viewing our behavior, it's increasingly coming through that lens, and that's relatively new. Second, there's a need to repair alliances and relationships. Europeans, in direct contrast, I think, to how China views this, have generally seen resilience in our institutions, right? So they sort of took the flip side of the coin and said, oh, wow, they had a lot of contestation, a lot of difficulty there. The institutions held, the system worked, so to speak. That gives us a certain amount of faith in what's going on. So very divergent perspectives there. And then there's this usual litany of other problems on the globe that we are unlikely to see quick resolution to, right? So we've got Iran simmering in the background. This is something that is likely to make it increasingly difficult to reapproach with European allies, right? So we've seen the Biden administration be a little bit tougher, I think, than people anticipated in terms of their response to how they were going to deal with Iran, particularly in the recent interview that President Biden gave. The Biden administration has attempted to sort of make the reapproachment with allies more about things like climate as opposed to Iran in order to change that conversation, but that's going to be a tension point, right? North Korea, the universal rule with North Korea is that if you ignore them, they blow something up, right? So you ignore North Korea at your peril, right? They will test something, missile, something along those lines, in order to maintain their position on the page. We have systematically been ignoring that as a flashpoint while that economy has come into pretty dire straits with regard to COVID and a variety of other internal challenges. You have to look for sort of action there. We remain at war in Afghanistan, lest we all forget, right? And so there's just this sort of steady drumbeat of problems that are out there that need to be confronted. But as I said before, we are unlikely to see sort of muscular engagement from this administration at the outset on these matters, at least in the first couple of years. Now, I think Nonetheless, there's a new team in place, right? There's a new conversation in place. There's a new foreign policy establishment in place. And so it's very worth kind of thinking about, if we want to understand how we're going to move forward, who are these people and what are they thinking? Okay, what are the things that people are talking about in DC right now? And there's a couple of documents that are making the rounds that I think are worth paying attention to if you care about these things in the level of detail that certainly I do, and certainly looking through all the folks who are on this call, I know many of you do. So one of these is a report that came out just a little while back. This is called Maintaining the Intelligence Edge. It's a CSIS report. It kind of comes across initially as being sort of one of 1,000 similar reports, right? And the reason I think you want to pay attention to it is that the lead author on this was Avril Haines, who just got confirmed as the DNI, right? So she is now in charge of the intelligence community. And this is basically a blueprint for how should we be structuring the intelligence community, right? What do we care about? And so you have basically the written word of the person who is now in charge in a public-facing document. Even more significantly, and I think less widely recognized, Haines was the lead person, or one of a couple of lead people on the foreign policy side of the entire Biden transition team, right? So in charge of sort of picking the team, not just in the IC, but more broadly, right? And so I think a lot of what goes on in this report is a blueprint for how a Biden administration as a group is thinking about the foreign policy challenge, all right? There's a couple threads that I think are really worth pulling out here and paying attention to. The key one of these is the centrality of technology and technological competition, all right? And this is something that I think it's become so in the water in the way we think about foreign policy, particularly sort of in elite policy discussions, that we are effectively in a technological competition with particularly China, but globally, right? And to the extent that we are to remain a country with an edge, it's going to be because we win in a competition of innovation, right? That we need to be out innovating, we need to be out designing, we need to be out technologying adversaries, okay? And I think that that's something that has become so common that it's rarely inspected in a serious way, right? We don't confront that as a question. We take it as a given, right? And this report has a lot of that. So recommendations, an innovation initiative, elevating open source intel as a core type of intel alongside human intel, signals intel. A lot of what that comes down to, though, is a story about artificial intelligence and machine learning, right? The capacity to aggregate and assess huge aggregate quantities of open source data, all right? Reshape IC human capital, particularly with regard to getting the right kind of people in who can do the right kind of innovation, leveraging allies, all right? Now, I'll come back to this in a minute, moving ahead to another report that I think is worth paying a lot of attention to. This is the somewhat immodestly named longer telegram that the Atlantic Council put out recently. It is by name and also by, being written by anonymous, clearly an attempt to invoke Kennan and the long telegram. This is a statement of, or an attempted statement of, US strategy toward China, and getting passed around a lot. I would say it's been received moderately poorly, would be the way I would describe it. But nonetheless, it has been pretty influential and captures a certain amount of thinking, a certain amount of talking, and makes for an interesting juxtaposition with that prior report on the IC, all right? The notion here is that China has changed, right? It is increasingly authoritarian, and it is increasingly aggressive. I think the former of those, that it is increasingly authoritarian, is pretty much agreed upon by everyone. The aggressive component is a difficult counterfactual, right? It's hard to know how aggressive China would be under different leadership if its power had gotten to the point where it is now, all right? So that's one point of contestation. The second sort of key theme of the report is that China has a strategy and the US doesn't, okay? And then it does, to its credit, sort of lay out some notions in terms of what should be done. It probably lays out too many notions. It is indeed the much, much longer telegram compared to Kennan's, and it's received some critique for that. But the idea is that US strategy should, among other things, leverage internal fault lines inside the CCP. So sort of leverage disagreements between President Xi and others in the party, right? And then it should rebalance the relationship with Russia in order to put some pressure on China from that side, okay? In terms of overall goals, you could to have a strategy, you have to have goals. Convince China that it is best to operate within the US-led international order, that it's best to avoid territorial challenges, and that it's best to not export its territorial model, okay? So kind of thinking that through and the combination of those things through, we're definitely increasingly in a position where there is across the board consensus inside DC that something needs to be done with China, right? It's much more a disagreement about details as opposed to overall objective, okay? And I think that's an interesting shift. One thing that I find sort of amazing about that longer telegram is the debate about who wrote it, right? So it ranges from the former Prime Minister of Australia to the current National Security Advisor to a former Deputy National Security Advisor under the Trump administration. All right, and so the bottom line is you read the document and it kind of could come from anywhere on the ideological spectrum, right? And to me, that's very revealing of a consensus. Now, again, kind of going to the prior points, one thing I think we really have to pay attention to is the extent to which that kind of consensus can be blinding, right? That we end up all thinking the same thing, speaking in the same terms, and therefore making the same mistake. So Biden was recently on doing an interview saying, hey, we need not have conflict, but there's going to be extreme competition, right? And I haven't seen that word extreme competition before. That's somewhat new. But I think the question is, well, what is the nature of this competition? And how is each side thinking about it? Going to the CSIS Haynes report, the US is clearly thinking about this as a competition of technological and economic advancement, right? It's all about who masters quantum computing. It's all about who masters artificial intelligence. It's about an increasingly autonomous capability in terms of defense. It's about space, whatever it might be, but it's technology, it's capability. For China, sort of going back to threads that exist inside of that, of the longer telegram report, but also just sort of other work that I've done, this is increasingly a competition of societal mobilization, right? It's who can mobilize their society. And those are very, very different objectives, okay? And so one thing that I think we really have to consider is how those interface with one another. If we're actually pursuing two different goals, what's that gonna do, okay? Another key theme here that I think sort of comes out somewhat in the longer telegram, but also is revealed in other work, is that China is changing, right? But unlike the way that the longer telegram describes it, what it's becoming in many ways is a more normal autocracy. Okay? It's a country that we are better positioned to deal with in several regards. In particular, the fact that the country has increasingly sort of personalized under President Xi leads to a situation where it doesn't have this capacity to do the multi-year delayed gratification Deng Xiaoping type strategy, all right? And that was always very, very challenging for the US to confront, right? The sort of keep low and grow power approach, bide time approach was very, very challenging for foreign policymakers in a democracy to deal with, all right? So for China, under Xi, delayed gratification has become harder. But increasingly also the slights are more keenly felt. They have a thinner skin. They're not able to sort of shrug off indignities because it threatens the individual and it therefore threatens the regime, okay? And then sort of building on this, and again, a thread that's in the longer telegram, but one that I would really pull out for you to think about more seriously, is that the nature of legitimacy in China has changed in ways that make this confrontation more difficult, okay? Whereas before, the legitimacy came off of economic growth, which would be a dimension that would be similar to this idea of competition on a technological and economic advancement level. It's increasingly about nationalism, right? Economic growth was something that I think could be pursued for a time, but once you reach middle income status, it's increasingly challenging to deliver on. And so for a country with shortened time horizons under Xi, the question is, well, how do you maintain legitimacy? How do you maintain popular consent? And the answer has increasingly been nationalism. So when you look at some of this work, some of the stuff that's going on in Xinjiang with the Uyghur minority, or in Tibet, or around the country with other minorities, I think people are increasingly making the mistake of thinking of that as an outcropping of authoritarianism, right? Growing authoritarianism. And they really need to be thinking about it as an outcropping of increasing Han nationalism, right? Which is fostered by the regime in order to promote stability and promote its own position, okay? And again, that really has deep implications for how the country is going to respond to some of these prescriptions that are given in these reports, all right? And in particular, I think it goes to this idea that I'll leave you with as sort of a provocative statement, which is, are we comfortable with this spheres of influence world? Because when you take this combination of general inattentiveness to foreign policy at key moments on the US side, with what the Chinese are attempting to do from a legitimation strategy, you really have a recipe for them grabbing hold of a part of the world and holding it as a sphere of influence. Where I think the long telegram goes wrong is this notion that Chinese are endlessly expansionist. I don't think that's quite right now. But what they are is very interested in dominion over their particular part of the planet, right? And so are we okay with that? And how do we change our strategy either to confront and prevent that, or more significantly and more likely live with it, right, in a way that's productive? So I will leave it there for sake of conversation and open up the floor.
If everyone's just jumping in, I have a question going back to your kind of cycles of political experience and power, Professor Potter.
Yep.
And I just wonder, to what extent is this, like, democracy has features and bugs? To what extent should we just accept this as a bug of democracy and kind of move on with that knowledge? Or like, what mitigating actions can we take to improve in the future?
Yeah, I think that that's a really well taken point, right? Democracy has a lot of bugs, and we tend to be okay with them because that is what it means to have a full turnover in the executive, right? There's going to be inexperience, for example, right? The inattentiveness to foreign policy is, in a lot of ways, for the US, it's geographic, right? It's that we have had the cultural luxury of not being particularly engaged at an individual level with affairs abroad, right? So I think your notion that in general it's something that we're okay with and are likely to have to live with is the right one. A lot of what happens in the US is that foreign policy is effectively delegated to a foreign policy elite, right? Because most people aren't paying attention most of the time. They check back in only when something happens they really don't like. A lot of casualties in a world war they don't understand. A lot of complaints from folks on the Hill in the party they trust, right? So I'm a Republican or a Democrat, and my own co-partisans are saying, like, hold on, what's going on here? I don't like this a bit, right? That tends to cause Americans to wake up and take notice. So in the aggregate, I think that that's the system we live in, and that's the system we embrace. At a micro level, I do think it's certainly worthwhile to think about, hey, how do we get people more engaged in some of these decisions, understanding these things a little bit better, and even more so, how do we build systems that are inclusive of more kind of outsider knowledge and opinions, so that that elite that it's delegated to is a little less insular, right? A little bit fewer blinders, less insular, more vital in a lot of ways. You don't see the same people popping up over and over again. So that's kind of what I would suggest. But in the end, it's the terrible system except for all the others, as the old adage goes, right? Ethan.
Hi, Professor Potter. So you mentioned that you seem to disagree with the longer telegram and presenting China as kind of infinitely expansionist. So I'm curious, I guess, kind of how you feel about the inroads they've made in places like Africa and even Central Asia, as far as like Belt and Road Initiative. And if there's anything you think the Biden administration can or should do to kind of counter that.
So I'm working on a book right now on sort of repression and political violence in China and Central Asia, so the Xinjiang sort of thing. And one of the key theses there is that if the Chinese want to mess around in Central Asia, then that's their prerogative, right? That is not sort of a place where the U.S. has a lot of reach, a lot of interests. It's their back door, and it also is probably a fairly strong indication that they're feeling constrained in parts of the world where we do have more interest, right? So I think part of growing up and dealing with what is increasingly a peer competitor is you have to give them some place and say, okay, yeah, you have more significant national interests there than we do, right? And so I would say Central Asia is a good example of that. Now, some of the things that they're doing there are exceptionally objectionable. Okay, so we don't have to be okay with that. What I'm getting at more is the notion of, hey, whose sphere of influence is this, right? And that is pretty clearly not ours. So I would certainly kind of think about that in one bucket. This broader question of Africa and then increasingly South America and places that are much closer to sort of our part of the world, so to speak. I think it largely comes down to what are they doing there, right? What are they doing and what is their intent? And we need to do a much better job separating the things that are malign and potentially not in our interest in terms of certain types of control of ports, certain types of investments, certain things along those lines, versus the kinds of things that most very wealthy countries do in terms of foreign direct investment, whatever it might be, right? And so I think part of what this comes down to, and I would say that this is not my idea, and this is something that is happening in real time, is this is sort of growing into where China is at present in terms of what are acceptable and unacceptable behaviors. And where it gets tough sometimes, I think, is it can be politically fraught to be willing to say things like, well, maybe US absolute primacy in this domain is not a realistic objective, right? That can be a very challenging thing to say in certain political contexts, in certain domains, right? But at a certain point, it has to give way to realism if anyone's going to be able to generate a strategy that makes any sense, okay? Because absolute primacy isn't always an achievable ends. Kevin, go ahead.
Good afternoon, Dr. Potter. Kind of going off of that and maybe, accepting that China's going to have this role going forward. What do you think about some of the attempts with the Quad nations or the so-called, Japan, India, Australia attempts to kind of coordinate with the US and it seems like it might be an attempt to constrain China, but maybe do you see that as being productive or viable or trying to have that sort of alliance in the South Asia area?
I mean, I think it's vital to a certain extent, right? So I think there will increasingly be very interesting developments between the US and Japan and Australia, right? And again, that's neither new nor my idea, right? Lots of people have sort of looked at that sort of grouping of states as countries that will have to deal with China, again, geographically, right? Our Pacific coast is a good deal back, but nonetheless, that is sort of our world as well. And then, Japan and Australia aren't going anywhere, right? They're no matter what the sort of long-term situation is, they're going to be part of this equation, okay? I think where we have to sort of separate, long-term friends and allies from sort of more notional relationships is when it comes to countries like India. right? We've never quite been able to get square with India. And there are a lot of really compelling reasons for that, that are not just, I think often in DC, that's attributed to sort of a lack of attentiveness. We haven't kept our eye on the ball. It's a lot more than that. And so I think that we probably need to be able to have multiple kinds of relationships, right? And we do. That's how we handle these sorts of things, from the very, very close, right, Five Eyes type relationships, to highly inclusive with the Japanese, to more collaborative with the Indians and others in the region, and particularly the capacity to engage collaboratively on specific initiatives. And some of that sort of more transactional component to foreign policy, I think, is healthy. Jerry, go ahead.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks very much for doing this. I want to throw a kind of a lob. I was struck, Professor Golden and I are teaching a large undergraduate class this semester. We begin by talking about international issues, and we point out how many are really transnational: immigration, climate, COVID, obvious examples. And thank you, you are a guest lecturer, you're a featured guest lecturer. We look forward to that. But a whole bunch of students come up to me right after the first class and say, hey, I'm international relations curious. I want to know more about places on grounds where I can go. And I send them to the National Security Policy Center. I encourage them to join the International Relations Organization, one of my favorite student groups. I talk about stuff at the Miller Center that Batten does routinely, talk about foreign affairs. But would you talk a little bit about the different spaces around grounds where students can associate themselves, both undergrads and grads, and who are curious about careers in the national security space?
I think you have to throw, some dagger of a question after that, because that really is a lob right there. So think on what the dagger that follows is.
I'll have a twist.
But I would say that you've named the big ones, and I would certainly say, one of the ones that really I've been incredibly impressed with is that International Relations Club, right, which is entirely student run. They do cool things. Frankly, all we do for them is we buy them pizza periodically and we give them a couple simulations a year, right? But everything else that they're doing is internal and really organic and really interesting. And so I think that's really neat. Certainly at NSPC, we do quite a lot in terms of research assistantships. And so people who are interested in actually working on government projects and reports, as well as sort of our own research reports and things along those lines. That's a really terrific thing. And it kind of builds out to this ecosystem. So the other part of this, for folks who are on this call who have some availability, our Hacking for Defense program, where we have students in a classroom setting working on real DoD problem sets. That then kind of dovetails with our research assistantships and our summer programs and things along those lines. So there's quite a lot going on, and frankly, it doesn't really matter where you hitch on. As soon as you start pulling the thread, it all kind of connects up, whether it's over to the Miller Center or with us or with you, Jerry, or whoever it might be. So part of it is just getting going. And I say, it's preaching to the choir a little bit, because I recognize an awful lot of faces on this from those sorts of things.
All right, my nasty follow-up.
There we go.
I had to have one just out of friendship. What's up with Susan Rice moving from a non-confirmable post at NSC to a domestic affairs post after she was running for vice president on that little shortlist campaign? Could you talk a little bit about the effect of a personality, her background, her skill set, and perhaps a possibility she doesn't play well with others that caused her to get a non-confirmable domestic post in this administration? And I have no follow-up to that. That's my twist.
Yeah, I think it goes, though, to one of the interesting components of how this team has been put together, right? And the foreign policy to the domestic policy, she's not the only one who's crossed that boundary, right? We've seen a certain amount of permeability there, and the notion has been much more on sort of who do we trust, right? And who do we have experience with? And who do we feel like is smart and we can kind of work with, kind of. And that has its upsides and its downsides. And I am a fan of a lot of the people who are in this administration, but I do think that we owe it to ourselves to think about what the downsides are. And in some ways, this is a team that I think is probably susceptible to a certain amount of overconfidence, right? Because they all do kind of know each other. There is, I think, a little bit too much in terms of, hey, the grownups are back. Like we can make this work because we're pros. We know the city. We've been in these offices. We've had these fancy jobs before. In prior administrations, you can go back to Kennedy, you can go back to Eisenhower, you can look at other teams that were put together that way, and you can see them making particular types of mistakes in terms of overconfidence, failure to share information because you kind of think you've got it all under control, or you have a special relationship with the guy in charge, or whether it's in your building or in the White House or wherever it might be. And so I do think that we need to be cautious about the idea that, hey, we're good now. Everything's under control. Because, go into sort of that first question, as administrations gel, it's tough. Now, particular to the Rice example, I'm not, privy to anything that anyone else isn't reading in the media on that one. My take is actually that, yes, she had some political problems on the Hill that are well known, right? But they were going to use her somewhere, right? And because of that trust and that team component, and that's sort of what you saw happen there. And so I think it's an interesting thing, but it's not something we haven't seen before.
Really helpful. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Ray. John, go ahead.
I thought it was interesting when you said that the situation in Xinjiang is more of an outgrowth of Han nationalism than an increase in authoritarianism. And I was kind of curious to learn more about like the motivations that the CCP has in persecuting the Uyghurs. Is it really just kind of based purely on like a disdain for an ethnic minority, or is there some sort of greater strategic rationale that they have?
I don't think there's a ton in terms of strategic rationale, right? It cuts much closer to the bone on this one, which I think is why we in the US tend to misunderstand it. Part of it comes from sort of a profound intolerance in what is, as I was saying, sort of an increasingly thin-skinned regime for any kind of political violence or dissent, right? And so where we look at it and we say, hey, there's been almost no terrorist attacks in that region, right? Very, very little has happened compared to other countries around the world. It's not the right metric because essentially anything more than zero is in the unacceptable realm. And what I sort of challenge people with is, hey, that's not that different than us, right? In terms of the acceptability of political violence, right? We are highly intolerant of what other countries would view as manageable levels of political violence, particularly if it's emanating from some sources, right? So, 9/11 being a prime example of this, right? Total unacceptability, lots of conversation post 9/11 and how we were going to kind of drive terrorism down to zero of that sort. So there's that component of challenge to it. And then I think there is this uncomfortable component of the way the state was built that is, again, overlooked and very interesting, right? So China borrowed a lot of the Soviet model in terms of how it handled minorities, right? They should be given autonomous regions, sort of Marxist-Leninist thought that everyone was moving in the same direction, but at different speeds, and therefore they should be given some autonomy. That has completely gone out the window at this point, right? And so you're looking at sort of vestigial organizations in terms of autonomous regions with an increasing idea of 100% assimilation, right? And that anything that is not full assimilation is a challenge to the legitimacy of the state. And so it comes down to this idea that there is just an increasingly restrictive notion of what it means to be Chinese, and it's in many ways overdue. Because what was fascinating about China for a long time is that it was able to go as long as it did without any clear ideology at all, right? It sort of the more sort of Marxist communist component of it faded away. It was replaced by this, hey, if we help you grow, deliver on development, then you should allow us to rule. And then, as I was saying, that can't go on forever. And so you need a new legitimation strategy. And a form of sort of more stringent nationalism is a time-honored one, right? That's the obvious one you take off the shelf. And I think we're seeing some of that in this region. And therefore, we tend to misunderstand how dearly held some of the motivations are that are leading to these outcomes. Okay, and so the idea that we can sort of say, oh, these are human rights violations and you should stop, I think often misunderstands how committed Chinese leadership is to some of the positions that are leading to these outcomes, right? And that doesn't mean that that can't be handled in some other way or could be shaped or molded, but you have to understand the interests of the other side if you are going to shape the policy in any way. And I think we just don't do a great job of that.
Great, thank you.
Absolutely.
Phil, you've got a couple questions in the chat as well.
Oh, okay. All right, so from the top, Libby says, building off Ethan's question, how do we counter the unacceptable behaviors in Africa, debt diplomacy? You know, some of it I think comes down to spending our own money, right? So when we sort of, we got into a world where we increasingly put strings on our resources. And that was a reasonable thing to do when there were not competitors out there. Frankly, when you go back shortly after World War II, we didn't put a lot of strings on our resources. We did things that looked a little bit more like what the Chinese are doing. And so I think some of it is kind of getting out there in a more serious way. That can be politically challenging in a world where we are, you know, thinking about stimulus spending and all kinds of other things. We don't want to run up the debt too much. So then the other part of this, I think, comes down to helping countries recognize the downsides of some of these relationships. And this is something where the Chinese are helping us out, right? The sort of switch part of the bait and switch has increasingly come to the front in terms of some of these port relationships and things along those lines. And so countries are increasingly saying, oh, like maybe we don't want to get too far down that path. So maybe thinking about some of the US or international institutions, you know, the strings they put on their money, maybe those aren't so bad, right? And so it's a little bit sort of dialing back the conditionalities, and it's a little bit helping people understand that those are there can be unstated conditionalities that you want to be awfully careful of when you take certain types of investment in certain types of assets. So Anthony says, the coincidence of an increase in Chinese nationalism and a growing personalization of the Chinese national identity and thinning of skin seems like a system ready to snap in any directed push. Which way would you go to? Which way would this snap go? Do you think? Would it go in a? Okay, I get it. I don't think the Chinese system is super fragile, and that's the part of this question that I might react to. I think that there are, we tend to overemphasize, and this is a part where I don't necessarily agree with that longer telegram. There are cleavages, right, resulting from Xi's increasing sort of personalization of Chinese rule, but I think they can be substantially overstated. And I think getting inside of those cleavages is something that we probably are going to have a lot of trouble doing with the precision that would be required. Any more than other countries are able to get inside of our cleavages in a durable and effective, and most importantly, in a predictable way, right? The outcomes there become super unpredictable. And so, you know, my personal take, and this is very much a personal take, is that we sort of have to take China as a given, right? And this is sort of what I mean about that increasing maturity in our approach to the country. A very big country with a lot of people and a lot of human capital, right? And so in many regards, they are taking their normal place in the world, okay? And so the question is then, well, how do you adapt to that? How do you shape that in ways that are congruent with US interests? This is a very, very different challenge than dealing with the Soviet Union, right? This is a much, much bigger country. And I think we often sort of fail to learn that lesson. That, you know, if you think of it as almost like a gravity model or something like that, it's just a monstrous thing, right? And so in order to sort of outcompete them, if it's a chip counting contest, very, very different type of competition, because we would have to substantially overperform our sort of natural order, and they would have to substantially underperform. And so those aren't odds you sort of like at the outset. And so I wouldn't be thinking about sort of fracturing them and sending them back to the 1980s so much as, hey, how do you accommodate and shape policy in a way that remains congruent with US interests? Camille, go ahead.
Yeah, this is going to be sort of a vague question, but going back to Biden's just overall foreign policy agenda, do you think that his sort of long history as a senator and a vice president, and the fact that he hasn't often maybe gotten his way or his ideal foreign policy going in the past. Do you think that will have any effect on sort of his outlook as just a president? Do you think he'll try to have like personal projects at all, or do you think he's just going to sort of toe the line more generally in American foreign policy?
I would say I don't really know. I think the Biden foreign policy remains nascent in a lot of ways. What I certainly pick up on from people is that there's a couple of things they're definitely a little more muscular than I think people anticipated, right? In terms of, so what I immediately will do with a VP like Biden is sort of say, well, okay, how's this different from the Obama foreign policy, right? And since it's a lot of the same characters, I think they're thinking about this too. A little bit more muscular, a little bit more decisive, and they're trying for a little bit less micromanaged. I think one thing that folks often miss is the extent to which a lot of the Obama foreign policy insiders didn't really love the way Obama foreign policy was run, right? So this was an internal concern. NSC's way too big, too much micromanagement going on from the top, no decisions ever get made, just general indecisiveness. And so this group certainly seems to feel that and be attempting to deal with it. And I do think that you will consistently see a little bit more of a confrontational style than maybe people were ready for, right? So we saw that with the statement on Iran recently. I think that was a little bit more than people were anticipating. Similar thing with China, a little bit more heavy on the confrontation than people were anticipating. So that's kind of what I see it gelling as. The extent to which that is really, Biden getting what he always wanted as a senator, I don't know. I don't think so, really. I don't know that he really had a ton of opinions as a senator in many ways. And that's one of the oddities of our system.
We've got time for about one more question if anyone else has a question. You can either type it out or raise your hand or. Anyone else? I think there we go. From Dean Alan Sam, what's the greatest risk they face?
Who's they? Biden administration? Oh, Biden, yeah, okay. So what's the greatest risk the Biden administration faces? I think it's sort of in that black swan category, right? I don't like the whole feel with both Iran and North Korea. I don't think the greatest risk in the short term is China, because China has, a hand on the tiller, so to speak. I think long term, certainly China's the problem, but that's not what I think should be keeping people up at night in the short term. I think the notion that you have, extreme pressure applied to Iran and North Korea, although through different means, or at least that country's feeling extreme pressure, while the rest of the globe is, trying to push foreign policy out of sight, out of mind to the greatest extent possible, is a little bit of a recipe for disaster, because some of those countries may reach breaking points where they have to lash out. And so to me, the greatest risk is some juxtaposition of one of those two flashpoints flashing, and then an inexperienced administration that is intent on demonstrating a certain amount of decisiveness and muscularity, reacting in a way that is not optimal, right? So that certainly, to me, would be the biggest issue. I don't know which of the two it's going to be, because I don't have a bead on sort of what the ignition switch would be. It's just much more that those sort of pots with the pressure on them are where I see the big problems, because that's where the crisis comes out. All right, thanks everyone. This was fun.
Thanks everyone, and thank you, Professor Potter. And stay tuned for a big lineup of events coming up. So just keep watching your emails, and we're really appreciative of your time. And thanks for your insights. Everybody have a good day and stay safe out there.